Lucia lived in a small, isolated village, surrounded by an arid landscape that seemed to mirror her own life. The young single mother faced increasingly difficult days, struggling to mold her clay pots, which were gradually losing their value in a place where almost no one had enough to eat. Her son, Pedro, was her greatest reason to carry on, even as the boy's health weakened daily. Exhaustion and hunger weighed on her shoulders, but what truly crushed her was the helplessness she felt facing Pedro's illness. For Lucia, overcoming seemed like a distant word, an almost unreachable hope. Yet, even in the darkness, the silent determination of a mother remained alive. Every day, she woke up before sunrise, lighting the fire in her clay oven with the little wood she could gather. It was a relentless routine, marked by long hours of work and few coins in hand. Pedro, still feverish, watched his mother with tired eyes, yet filled with a trust that only children possess. He believed that somehow, she would find a solution to everything, and that faith propelled her forward. Lucia felt the weight of responsibility grow with each look from her son, but along with it, an internal renewal blossomed, a desperate need to fight for both of their survival. She didn't know how, but something had to change. The village, though small, also bore its own burden. The residents, who once lived modestly, now found themselves increasingly at the mercy of scarcity. There wasn't much to hope for, and each day felt like a painful repetition of the last. Lucia, despite being known for her skill with clay, could no longer sell her pieces as before. The world around her seemed to be collapsing, and the humiliation of not being able to provide for her own son wounded her heart. Still, there was a spark of hope in her chest, a feeling that somehow things could improve. With each passing day, Lucia wondered how she could escape this spiral of suffering. The answer seemed non-existent until, on an ordinary day, something unexpected happened. She had gone to gather dry wood in the nearby forest when, stumbling over a root, something hard and hidden beneath the mud caught her attention. It was an old wooden chest, partially buried, as if it had been waiting for someone. The discovery brought a mixture of curiosity and fear to her heart. Could this be the opportunity for change she so longed for? Or just another challenge to overcome? Upon opening the chest, Lucia found something she could never have imagined. Inside lay an aged parchment resting on a small pouch of gold coins. The shine of the coins dazzled her vision for a moment, but what truly caught her attention was the message on the parchment. It promised even greater riches, but with a warning: this treasure could bring hidden dangers. Hope and fear danced in her mind. The coins could save Pedro, but what if they brought destruction to her life? With every thought, her determination grew. She knew she was facing an impossible choice. Lucia hesitated for a few minutes, looking at the gold. Was this what would change her and Pedro's fate? Or would that chest bring only more complications? The memory of the words on the parchment made her tremble inside. The gold, which seemed so tempting, now carried the weight of a possible curse. But, like any mother facing despair, she knew she needed to make a decision. Pedro didn't have much time left. He needed help, and she had to believe that she could find a way out. The treasure before her represented hope, but also a dangerous renewal of her path. Still, something within her hesitated. What if all this was nothing but an illusion? The humiliation of not being able to do anything for Pedro was already great enough. If something went wrong, she would lose everything. But at the same time, hope, albeit cautious, took root in her heart. Lucia knew she was on the verge of a life-changing decision, but she still didn't know if it would be for better or worse. She finished storing the coins in a bag, feeling that, one way or another, life was pulling her towards something much greater than she could imagine. Along with the gold, there was an aged parchment, its letters almost faded by time. She unrolled it carefully and read the words that spoke of unimaginable riches but also of hidden dangers. The promise was tempting, but the warning seemed too dark to ignore. The gold could be her salvation or her downfall. Lucia held the parchment with trembling hands, feeling that a monumental decision lay ahead. The gold could bring the renewal she so desperately longed for, but the consequences were still unknown. The young mother found herself torn. On one hand, the hope of a better future for Pedro, with the money that could save him. On the other, the doubt the parchment sowed in her mind. It was a cruel choice, a dilemma that pulled her in opposite directions. But as she held the coins, she felt she no longer had time. Pedro needed urgent help. Would this discovery lead her to overcome the humiliation of not being able to do more for her son? Or was it just the beginning of something far more dangerous? Lucia returned home, feeling the weight of that discovery grow in her chest. The coins seemed to shine even more intensely in her mind as she tried to imagine the possibilities. But the words of the parchment echoed in her head like a distant warning, a whisper that insisted on reminding her of the dangers. The hope for a better life for Pedro began to blend with the fear of what was to come. The gold represented more than just a chance for survival. It was also a door to a world she didn't yet understand. As she looked at her feverish son, lying on his small straw bed, Lucia felt the conflict grow within her. She could use the coins to buy medicine and save. Lucia looked at her son, feeling a mixture of despair and guilt. The gold gleamed like a promise of hope, but also as a constant reminder of the danger that might lie behind it. The moral dilemma she faced was suffocating, and with each glance at Pedro, the need to act grew more urgent. That night, as Pedro slept beside her, Lucia stayed awake, thinking about the chest and what she should do. It was impossible to ignore the weight of that choice. The gold seemed a blessing, but what about the warning in the parchment? Her determination to save Pedro was stronger than any fear, but what would those coins bring into their lives? Lucia's mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions, and every passing second brought her closer to a decision that would change everything. When the sun began to rise, Lucia had already made her decision. She would use the gold, but with caution. She knew she couldn't ignore the parchment's warning, but she also couldn't let Pedro fall ill without trying everything. The renewed hope that the gold brought was too strong to abandon. It was time to act, to face the consequences and fight for her son's life, even if it meant stepping into an uncertain path. The courage blooming in her chest was the only thing keeping her standing. The gleam of the gold coins seemed like a light at the end of the tunnel, a unique opportunity to overcome the poverty and humiliation that life had imposed on her. But the words of the parchment, always present in her mind, reminded her that the choices we make can have consequences we cannot foresee. Lucia knew that once she started down this path, there would be no going back. The fate of Pedro and her own were now tied to that mysterious chest. Trying to ease the weight of her indecision, Lucia told a neighbor about the chest and the coins. The response was loud, humiliating laughter. You thought this was going to be your salvation? Or are you going to end up worse than you already are? The woman mocked, spreading laughter throughout the village. That reaction felt like a punch to Lucia's stomach. The cruel words echoed in her mind, making her question her own luck even more. She returned home feeling more humiliated than ever, as if trapped in a cycle of misery from which she would never escape. The village's laughter, combined with the parchment's warning, filled Lucia with uncertainty. She wondered if all this was just a sign not to meddle with something so dangerous. However, looking at Pedro, pale and weaker every day, the dilemma became even more painful. She wanted to believe that the gold could be her salvation, but the fear of making a mistake kept her from acting. The decision to use or not use the coins became a heavier burden each day, and Lucia felt her determination waver. The weight of humiliation began to affect Lucia in ways she hadn't even imagined. The people around her treated her with disdain, as if simply finding the gold was a reason for ridicule. She avoided leaving the house, fearing more laughter or judgmental looks. The hope she had felt upon discovering the coins began to fade, replaced by a growing fear that she was facing a trap. Each step seemed uncertain, every choice brought her closer to an invisible abyss. However, as much as fear and humiliation had paralyzed her for a moment, Lucia couldn't ignore the call to act. She knew Pedro's time was running out and that the gold might be their only chance to save him. The cautious hope still pulsed in her chest, though mixed with the terror of the unknown. Choices like this seemed too cruel for someone already carrying so many burdens, but Lucia felt she had to move forward, somehow or other. Determination and fear battled within her. Lucia looked at Pedro one more time as he slept and realized that time was running out. Hope was all she had, even if fragile. She decided to seek out John, believing he could help her make a decision. The weight of humiliation still accompanied her, but her courage was beginning to bloom once again. There was more at stake, and she was willing to take the risk, even if everything was against her. With the coins stored in a small bag, Lucia left home early in the morning. The path to John's house was long and silent, but with each step, she felt her determination grow within her. The hope, though full of uncertainties, began to shine again. She knew she couldn't keep running from her choices and that facing the unknown was her only chance. Deep down, Lucia knew that her journey was just beginning and that John could help her find the answers she so desperately needed. Lucia arrived at John's house with her heart pounding. The wise man's small cabin was hidden among the village trees, a place that seemed isolated from all the chaos and judgment that surrounded her. John was known for his wisdom, his ancient stories, and his calm way of facing life. With the coins tucked in her bag, Lucia entered the cabin, hoping to find answers for the doubts that plagued her. She knew John could help her understand the true meaning of that mysterious treasure. John greeted her with a calm gaze, his eyes shining with the wisdom accumulated over the years. He listened in silence as Lucia told him about the chest, the gold coins, and the parchment with its enigmatic warning. When she finished speaking, she felt a slight relief, as if, for the first time, she was sharing her burden with someone who truly understood. John examined the coins cautiously, but it was the parchment that caught his attention. He recognized those words and the story behind that treasure. With his usual calmness, John explained that the gold belonged to an ancient baron of the region, a man known for his corrupt and shady dealings. According to legend, those who got involved with the baron's riches ended up trapped in a web of corruption and destruction. The gold, despite its tempting gleam, carried a burden few could bear. John warned Lucia not to be seduced by the coins, as the price to pay could be too high. His words were harsh, but filled with a profound truth. John's warnings sent a chill down Lucia's spine. The gold, which once seemed like the solution to her problems, now appeared even more dangerous. She listened carefully as John recounted stories of people who had been destroyed by attempting to use that treasure. The stories were frightening, but Lucia knew she couldn't simply ignore what she had found. Pedro was getting sicker, and she didn't have time to hesitate. The moral dilemma she faced grew, but now she had something more to consider: the weight of the gold's curse. Perceiving Lucia's internal conflict, John offered her more than just advice. He knew that even with the best intentions, a mother's heart could not be restrained by words of caution. So, he offered her an alliance. He would help investigate more about the gold and the baron, while Lucia sought an immediate solution for Pedro's health. John believed that together they could find a path that didn't involve the dangers of the coins. There was hope, but Lucia needed the courage to proceed without succumbing to the lure of the gold. John's wisdom brought a bit of peace to Lucia's heart, yet doubts still haunted her. What should she do? Ignore the gold and risk Pedro's life? Or use the coins, despite the warnings, and face the consequences later? Her son's life was in her hands, and the fear of making the wrong decision was almost unbearable. John was a wise mentor, but Lucia knew that in the end, the choice was hers. The weight of responsibility suffocated her, but the hope of finding a solution kept her firm. With John's words echoing in her mind, Lucia decided she couldn't act hastily. She thanked the wise man for his advice and promised to think over everything he had said. As she walked back home, she felt there was more at stake than just gold. The stories she had heard about the baron and his corrupt riches made her question what lay behind that mysterious chest. Lucia made a risky decision. Pedro's time was running out, and she couldn't wait any longer. With a heavy heart and the determination of a mother willing to do anything, Lucia took part of the gold coins and set off to the neighboring town. She knew she was crossing a dangerous line, but her son's health came before any fear. The gleam of the gold gave her a thread of hope, even if the fear of the unknown still haunted her steps. Arriving in town, Lucia found a merchant willing to buy the coins. He seemed suspicious, but the gold spoke louder. Selling the first coins, Lucia felt a momentary relief. The money she had received could help Pedro. However, the sense that something was wrong didn't disappear. As she returned home, she noticed curious glances following her through the streets. Something had changed in the air, and Lucia knew that by selling those coins, she had attracted unwanted attention. It didn't take long for the news of the gold sale to spread. Upon returning to the village, Lucia discovered that she had attracted the attention of Mauricio, a powerful local businessman known for his criminal activities. He controlled the town and the underworld with an iron fist, and the mere mention of wealth made him act quickly. Lucia began to receive threatening messages, demanding that she reveal the origin of the coins. Fear took hold of her, and the relief she had felt after selling the gold quickly turned into an even heavier burden. Mauricio was not a man to be trifled with. He was ruthless and typically eliminated anyone who got in his way. Lucia, now involved in something far greater than she had imagined, found herself cornered. Mauricio offered his protection, but his intentions were far from genuine. He wanted the coins, all of them, and demanded that Lucia collaborate with his schemes. The moral dilemma she had faced initially now seemed small compared to the real threat approaching. Pedro's safety was at stake. Though terrified, Lucia knew she couldn't give in. The temptation to hand over the coins to Mauricio and end everything was strong, but she knew that if she did, she would fall into a trap she could never escape. The weight of humiliation and despair intensified, but at the same time, a renewed determination began to grow within her. Mauricio might be powerful, but Lucia had something he didn't expect: courage and the willingness to fight for her son at any cost. With Mauricio's pressure mounting and the threats becoming more frequent, Lucia found herself at a crossroads. Pedro's safety was hanging by a thread, and she knew she would need help to face the businessman. So, she decided to seek John once again. He was her only hope. Arriving at the wise man's house, she told him everything that had happened since she sold the coins. John, with his calm gaze, did not seem surprised. He knew the gold would bring complications, but he also knew Lucia was ready to face what was coming next. John advised her not to give in to Mauricio's threats and promised to help her find a way to deal with the situation. He knew they would face difficult days, but he was also certain that Lucia possessed the strength to overcome it. She was crossing the first threshold of a dangerous journey, but John believed that overcoming humiliation and the rebirth of hope were possible. Lucia left John's house with a new plan in mind, though still with a heavy heart. Back in the village, Lucia felt she was being watched with every step she took. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and her intuition wouldn't let her ignore the signs. Something was wrong. She began to notice strange movements around her house, and more than once, she was sure someone was watching her. Mauricio was following through on his threat, and now, more than ever, Lucia knew she couldn't retreat. Pedro's life depended on her, and surrendering to fear was not an option. It was on a silent night that Lucia received the news she feared most. Pedro was gravely ill. The boy's fever had suddenly risen, and he could no longer get out of bed. Despair filled her heart, making her question if using the coins had been the right choice. Now, in addition to dealing with Mauricio's threats, she had to face the possible loss of her son. Each day seemed darker, and the hope she had once felt upon finding the gold began to fade. Despite the critical situation, Lucia was not completely alone. John, always attentive, realized the gravity of the situation and gathered some allies to help her in secret. Among them was Miguel, an honest policeman, tired of the injustices dominating the village and willing to expose the corruption network Mauricio commanded. He believed that, with the right information, they could dismantle the criminal operation. Lucia now had a small support network, but still, she felt the weight of fear and responsibility on her shoulders. Gradually, John and Miguel began piecing the puzzle together. Mauricio wasn't just interested in the gold coins. He was part of a smuggling network involving ancient treasures, and the gold Lucia had found was just the tip of the iceberg. John, with his knowledge of the region's ancient stories, helped Lucia understand the depth of the danger they were facing. The more they discovered, the more Lucia realized her fight wasn't just for Pedro's survival, but for justice for the entire village. Now surrounded by allies, Lucia began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. She knew the fight would be arduous, but her determination grew with each discovery about Mauricio's schemes. The businessman was more dangerous than she had imagined, and the smuggling network he commanded was deeply rooted in the city's corruption. Still, Lucia felt that, with the evidence they were gathering, there was a chance to defeat him. Fear remained present, but the hope for justice grew stronger every day. Meanwhile, the enemies were also moving. Mauricio's henchmen intensified their surveillance on Lucia, trying to intimidate her into revealing the coin's origin. She knew she was in danger, but the network of allies she had formed kept her strong. John, Miguel, and the few villagers who dared to help her became her strength. Even with constant threats, Lucia felt she was no longer alone in this fight. She was willing to face everything to protect Pedro and her village. With time running out, Lucia knew she had to act quickly. The evidence John and Miguel were gathering was strong, but they still needed the final blow, something that would incriminate Mauricio definitively. Every move she made was now strategic, every decision crucial. The feeling of being surrounded by enemies made her sleep with one eye open, but her determination was unwavering. Her courage renewed with each received threat, each step taken toward the truth. Mauricio, on the other hand, was growing more impatient. He couldn't allow Lucia to continue defying him. His henchmen increased the threats, and the pressure on her was becoming more intense. Lucia knew she was walking a tightrope, where a single misstep could cost Pedro's life. But the brave mother, determined to overcome humiliation and danger, would not let fear dominate her. She sensed that the moment of truth was approaching, and she needed to be prepared for the final confrontation. The nights became long for Lucia, with the silence of the darkness bringing a growing fear. Each day, she felt that Mauricio's grip was closing in on her. It wasn't just the threats but the constant sense that something terrible was about to happen. John's words about the cursed gold came back to her mind, but at the same time, her determination to save Pedro and bring down Mauricio pushed her forward. Lucia knew she was approaching a point of no return. It was during one of those tense nights that Lucia realized Pedro was gone. Her heart stopped for a moment, and a deep panic took over her body. She ran around the house, calling for him, but there was no sign of the boy. Her worst fears had come true. Mauricio had taken her son. Despair engulfed her, and Lucia felt the world around her crumbling. The air grew heavy, and the pain of not knowing where Pedro was crushed her. The danger, which had once seemed distant, was now a live and brutal threat. Lucia's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Tears ran down her face as she tried to understand how this had happened. The fear that had once been a constant presence now consumed her completely. The feeling of helplessness suffocated her, but at the same time, the anger of seeing her son in danger awakened an inner strength she didn't even know she possessed. Even with a broken heart, Lucia knew she couldn't give up. She needed to find Pedro, and for that, she would have to face Mauricio directly. As she ran through the village streets in search of answers, Lucia encountered familiar faces, neighbors, friends, all with expressions of fear and compassion. But no one dared to help her. The fear of Mauricio was too great, and Lucia was alone. However, she knew she had allies. John and Miguel awaited her at the wise man's cabin, and she went there, hoping they could give her a clue as to where Pedro was being held. The terror of losing her son forever was suffocating, but Lucia, determined, would not let fear win. Arriving at John's house, Lucia could barely speak. The despair on her face said it all. John and Miguel quickly understood what had happened. Pedro had been taken as retaliation, and they knew the situation had escalated to a dangerous level. Miguel, as a policeman, promised to use all his resources to find Pedro, while John, with his wisdom, tried to calm Lucia and ensure she stayed focused. The mission was now clear: to bring Pedro back and defeat Mauricio once and for all. Though devastated by fear, Lucia began to gather strength. With each passing moment, she felt that the renewal of her courage was her only chance. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by panic. She needed to be strong, for Pedro and for herself. With the help of John and Miguel, they crafted a plan to locate Mauricio's hideout. They knew time was short and that any mistake could cost Pedro's life. Lucia, determined to overcome all obstacles, promised herself she would do whatever it took to save her son. The path to Mauricio's hideout would be long and dangerous. Lucia knew she was about to face the greatest challenge of her life. Each step brought her closer to the truth and the final confrontation. Fear still pulsed in her chest, but the strength of a mother in despair was greater. The evidence they had gathered against Mauricio could be the key to freeing Pedro, but Lucia knew she would have to face the businessman face to face. It was a battle for her son's life, and she couldn't fail. Mauricio's hideout was in an old mansion on the outskirts of the city, guarded by his henchmen. Lucia, accompanied by John and Miguel, prepared for the final confrontation. Fear gripped her chest, but the determination to save Pedro was stronger. She had no choice but to face Mauricio directly. Each step she took toward the mansion felt heavier, but Lucia knew there was no turning back now. Her son's life was at stake. The mansion was dark and silent, except for the echoes of the guards' footsteps patrolling. Lucia's heart raced, but she remained calm. Miguel, being a policeman, crafted a careful plan to enter undetected, while John offered her advice on keeping her mind focused and clear. Deep down, Lucia knew this would be the decisive moment. She was about to face Mauricio and demand Pedro's return. But what would he ask in return? And more importantly, how would she come out of this alive and with her son safe? When she finally managed to enter the mansion, Lucia was taken directly to Mauricio. He was waiting for her, with a cold and calculated smile on his face. Pedro, tied up and scared, was beside him. Seeing her son in such a state made Lucia's heart ache, but it also ignited a flame of courage she didn't even know existed. Mauricio, in his arrogance, began to speak. He wanted the coins, all of them, and threatened to harm Pedro if Lucia didn't cooperate. The situation was desperate, and Lucia knew she was facing a cruel choice. With her heart racing and her mind struggling to stay focused, Lucia took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't simply give in to Mauricio's demands. If she handed over the coins, he would continue using them to fuel his corruption network, and she and Pedro would never truly be safe. But if she resisted, she risked her son's life. The tension in the air was suffocating. Lucia looked at Pedro, and something within her shifted. There was no room for hesitation. She needed to make a decision, and quickly. With a courage she hadn't known she possessed, Lucia decided she would not bow down to Mauricio. Facing him, even at the risk of losing everything, was the only way out. In a firm voice, she declared she would not give him the coins. The determination in her eyes was enough to surprise Mauricio, who hadn't expected this reaction. He tried to intimidate her, but Lucia remained resolute. She knew that if they succumbed to corruption, they would be condemned forever. And that would not be Pedro's future. As the tension reached its peak, Miguel and John sprang into action. The plan they had crafted to incriminate Mauricio was now in motion. With Miguel's help, who had gathered evidence against the businessman, they managed to disarm the guards and expose Mauricio's smuggling network. Though terrified inside, Lucia stood firm. She knew that this moment was decisive, not only to save Pedro but to bring Mauricio down once and for all. Her determination was unshakable. Mauricio, seeing that he was cornered, made a last-ditch attempt, but it was already too late. Miguel, as a policeman, had the power of the law on his side, and the evidence they had gathered was more than enough to arrest the businessman. The confrontation ended with Mauricio's arrest, and Lucia, exhausted, ran to embrace Pedro. Tears streamed down her face as she held her son in her arms, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. She had done it. Against all odds, she had saved Pedro and defeated her enemy. With Mauricio finally imprisoned, Lucia looked at John and Miguel, feeling a deep gratitude for all the help they had given her. But more than that, she felt immense pride in herself. She had faced fear head-on, overcome humiliation, and resisted the temptations of gold. Now, with Pedro safe and sound by her side, she knew the battle was almost over, but the journey was not yet finished. The evidence Lucia and her allies had gathered led to Mauricio's arrest and the dismantling of his smuggling network. The entire city breathed a sigh of relief upon learning that he would no longer control their destinies with fear and corruption. Lucia, now seen as a heroine by those who once ridiculed her, felt the change in how people looked at her. Her struggle had inspired others to stand up against injustice, bringing a renewal not only to her life but to the community. Lucia was rewarded for her courage. Part of Mauricio's confiscated assets was given to her, ensuring a more stable future for both Pedro and herself. The promise of a new life, free from the constant fear that once haunted her, now seemed closer than ever. With resources at her disposal, Lucia knew she could care for Pedro and rebuild her life as a potter. But more than the material reward, what she truly gained was something no money could buy: the certainty that hope, even in the darkest moments, can illuminate the most winding paths. The journey that led her to face Mauricio's dangers also brought with it a profound lesson. Lucia realized that the gold and riches she had found were never the true answer to her problems. It was her determination, her courage, and her love for Pedro that pushed her forward, even when everything seemed lost. The gold served only as a distraction, but in the end, it was her inner strength that truly saved her. She had proven to herself that she could overcome any obstacle, as long as she kept faith. Now, Lucia had a new outlook on life before her. She had defeated not only the corrupt businessman who threatened her family but also the fears and doubts that had always accompanied her. The community respected and admired her for her courage, and Lucia knew that, from that moment on, she could use her experience to help others facing similar challenges. The journey hadn't been easy, but the outcome was a complete renewal, both in her life and in Pedro's. Pedro, now recovered from his illness, looked at his mother with admiration. He didn't know all the details of the struggle she had fought, but he felt, in every gesture and look, how much of a true warrior Lucia was. She had fought against the impossible and won. And now, together, they could build a future where fear no longer had space, where hope reigned supreme. As days passed, Lucia began to notice the impact of her courage throughout the village. She, once seen as a mere potter, was now admired by everyone as a figure of strength and determination. Her journey, marked by dangers, humiliations, and difficult choices, had inspired those around her. The residents, who once lived in fear and under Mauricio's control, now found in Lucia an example of resilience. She had faced the unthinkable, and by doing so, she transformed the very village. The feeling of rebirth was palpable. Lucia was no longer the same person she once was. The experience of fighting for Pedro's life and facing Mauricio's corruption had profoundly changed her. She now walked the streets with a new posture, a confidence that had not existed before. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there, but not as marks of weakness. On the contrary, they were signs of a battle won, of a woman who had risen from the ashes stronger than ever. The community also began to change. Inspired by Lucia's example, the villagers united to confront other injustices they had long accepted as part of their lives. The fear that once paralyzed everyone was now disappearing, and a new wave of hope took over the village. Lucia, unintentionally, became a symbol of resistance, and her story was told by all as a lesson in courage. The power of one person to make a difference was now visible to everyone. With the resources at her disposal, Lucia began to invest in projects to help other mothers and families who, like her, struggled to survive. She knew that, despite her own victories, many people still faced similar challenges. The strength she had found in her journey was now shared with those around her. Lucia offered emotional and practical support to those in need, helping them see that, like her, they could overcome difficulties and find new hope. The former potter was now a respected figure in the village, but she kept the simplicity and humility that had always characterized her. Lucia knew that the true lesson she had brought from her journey was not the gold but the lessons of courage, determination, and resilience. What truly mattered was not the money but the ability to stand up in the face of adversity and help others do the same. With every person she touched, the village transformed even more, coming to life with the renewal Lucia had initiated. Pedro, always by her side, also grew inspired by his mother's journey. He saw her not only as a source of security but also as a living lesson in resilience. Lucia made a point of teaching her son that the greatest treasure they possessed was not the gold but the strength to face fear and never give up, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Pedro, now more confident and healthy, began to carve his own path, with the certainty that, with the courage inherited from his mother, he could face any challenge life threw his way. Lucia didn't stop there. She decided to turn her experience into something bigger, creating a support network for those facing injustices. What had started as a solitary struggle was now transforming into a movement that inspired the entire community. She used her past to build a better future, not only for Pedro but for everyone around her. The gold she had once feared ended up being a symbol of something much greater, the transformation of a woman who found her true strength by facing the impossible. With her journey complete, Lucia was now a heroine, not only for her personal achievements but for becoming a source of hope for so many others. Her story symbolized the opportunity to create a fairer community where fear and oppression would no longer have a place. Lucia's story was now told by all, and her lesson of courage, hope, and resilience would continue to echo for generations. She had found not only peace but also her true purpose.